Ladies and gentlemen, not to keep you further from the main fare of this book launch, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Professor Gerwel, and thank you especially because you've taken less time than you were allotted, which gives me room to say a few words myself. Now, I should have mentioned that among us here this morning are the publishers of this book and the editors. They have come all the way from New Zealand and from London to be present here. And if I can just ask them to stand up a bit. Thank you. Now, this is going to be a bestseller. And Long Walk to Freedom is already the bestseller. Now I see Chiba here, who was one of the conspirators in the Long Walk to Freedom, reducing it, Madiba's not very beautiful handwriting, to 50 pages, and Mac is not here, unfortunately, and smuggling it out. So I thought it's about time I should have a bestseller. I tried with my memoirs. It wasn't a failure, but it wasn't a bestseller. I think what I'm going to do is I'm contemplating writing a book called What Was Left Out of Long Walk to Freedom. And that may be something that may put me on the charts for the bestsellers. It's now my great pleasure to call upon Minister of Finance, Mr. Manuel, to address us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Kathy, Mr. President, Madiba, I should say it, Tia Graça, trustees of the respective foundations, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests. There are not many kinds of people who talk about books. The authors and publishers should. The critics should. Academics with a knowledge of the subject matter should. And presumably salespersons of books should. Now, I don't fall into any of those categories. I should have known this last week when Comrade Kathy asked me to say something here. But I was so overwhelmed by the request that I didn't actually pause to consider the fact that I fall into neither of those categories. So when Prof. Gerwel today says I'm a literary critic, you know, I'm really quivering in my boots. Now, I should admit that I tried the weekend to persuade a real literary critic that it wasn't my place to speak. I said to him, Mr. President, you know, in protocol terms, I can't have you sitting here while I say something. And he said, the deal is that I'm an ornament, I'm not allowed to say anything. And I still hope that I can overturn that. But I'm sure the biggest challenge to everybody who was involved in this project, the authors, the advisors, Comrades Kathy and Mac, all of the contributors, the family, everybody. I think the biggest challenge was to deal with the sense, not another Mandela biography. And I think it's very important that we recognize that is in fact the starting point. So what they've done is to take 88 years of South Africa's history, to record it in all its glory, and it clearly is a magnificent piece of history of the world, but of this country in particular. And through it, they've actually traversed the most wonderful journey in the life of Madiba. From Vesu to Qunu to Johannesburg, around the country and then through 12 African states, including a very important stint in Ethiopia, back to Durban, Pretoria, different circumstances, Robben Island, Portsmouth, Victor Verster, Johannesburg, Cape Town, Pretoria, to where we are today. And I think in traversing that route that Madiba walked, they were able to capture that very special part of history, that way in which Madiba was on the one hand shaped by, and on the other hand was a force for reshaping the history of this country. But if that was all they did, they would just have had another biography, denser, more pages, bit heavier, but still competing in the bestseller stakes, Comrade Kathy, with Long Walk, perhaps entitled Longer Walk. And then the innovation, and the innovation comes through the observations, the anecdotes, and the perspectives of 58 people from around the world who interacted with Madiba as friends, as comrades, as fellow prisoners, as prison warders, as celebrities, as colleagues, as employees, and even the odd successor. And I think that they brought all of this together to capture this mosaic of Madiba's life and to give a sense of life to those words that otherwise may have been just another history. And so there's this early account by Paulo Jordan that describes Madiba as one who's always set great store by what he'd learnt and absorbed in the rural setting. And you take it from there to Billy Nayer's description of Madiba as being both a Democrat and a gentleman of the first order. Now, there are some who would wonder about this, but it's there, it's recorded now. And then there's the humility and caring, which is described by so many different people, but communicated so poignantly by Eddie Daniels. There are several accounts of Madiba, the respectful militant, apparent from his communications with his captors to the messages conveyed to a range of commoners and also to heads of government, some of whom Madiba had fundamental disagreements with. I mean, there's a particular head of government of the period, and one of the points reflected on, I mean, she described Madiba as a terrorist once, but one of the first things he did was to ensure that her representative in the country conveyed a message of good wishes to her. Of the many stories of friendships, perhaps the most amazing is told by Bill Clinton, who describes the strength that Madiba was able to give him in the most difficult period in his life. And it's actually an incredibly beautiful story of how the messenger in the instance was the literary critic who didn't want to speak here today. A few words strongly conveyed that provided the strength to one of the most remarkable presidents in the United States in history to be able to see through what was clearly a huge assault on him. But it's about that leadership, it's about what we've read, what we've tried to learn. And as President Mbeki writes, and I quote, "I hope that people like Madiba and others of that senior leadership see in the younger people like us that they've succeeded in a way in replicating themselves." But before you arrive at the conclusion that the book is the extended citation to the Pope for the announcement of Saint Rolihlahla, let me advise that there are both counter accounts of these glowing anecdotes and those curious idiosyncrasies. I mean, I saw the word Anglophile more often in that book than in any other book. So I don't know what they're saying about this young man from the rural setting who carried with him the rural values, but there you have it. But I think the question is, of course, do the editors and the publishers succeed? I'd like the readers to be the judge of that. Though, as with Kathy, the book left me wondering about the bits that have not yet been recorded. What would Moses Kotane's recall be of the differences on the formation of Umkhonto weSizwe? And in fact, there are a few wonderful stories about that period that have not been written. What would former President F.W. de Klerk's recollection be of the day in which those three photos, and I think they published on page 253, the Star carries them this morning as well, what would his recall of that event be? Indeed, what would Nkosi Mangosuthu Buthelez's views be about how he got dragged? Was he kicking and screaming into the negotiations at the last minute? Or indeed, what would history have recorded if Madiba and Cecil Williams had followed the correct security procedures on that fateful trip to Durban? We can but wonder about these and many other stories, told and untold, in this wonderful compilation. The authors have woven the strong thread of what one author has called soft power throughout the book. Madiba's style is that of persuasion and example, consistently applied to a variety of circumstances. Now let me assure you that the power is not soft because of the absence of any other means. Madiba obviously learned from the many lunches at places like Capitan's that soft power only works if people on the other side understand that you have the masala to use if you need to. It's always been there. It shaped, I think, the life of Madiba. But perhaps the strongest sense that this portrait conveys is that Ubuntu is real. We are because they are. And that the values of Ubuntu and the commitments to service are as noble now as they were in Qunu in the 1920s, only perhaps more needed now to define us as Africans who care in a caring democracy. I'd like to express my sincerest appreciation to all who were involved in this production, and with it the hope that the messages will be understood and that the life of Madiba, which has been so graphically accounted, would, as the President said, be emulated by those who have the opportunity to do so in history. Thank you very much.